Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
The purpose of all of the work we put into a brew day is really to create a volume of bittersweet liquid that we call wort. It's only when yeast are added to that wort that it becomes beer, as this amazing little fungi is ultimately responsible for the fermentation process. Of course, several factors are at play when it comes to fermentation, hence the importance of ensuring that the yeast we pitch is as healthy as possible. You're listening to the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and this week I'm joined by contributor Jordan Folks to talk about the importance, or perhaps lack thereof, of yeast nutrients.
Whenever a new homebrewer asks me what I think is like the number one thing they should be paying attention to, I always say fermentation quality. You know, a healthy fermentation makes a great beer, or without it, you definitely run the risk to make a sub-quality, a poor beer. And perhaps yeast nutrient is one tool in the toolbox to help us get there.
Yeah, I've had this conversation with brewing friends of mine that you could take the crappiest wort and still make a completely drinkable beer. It may not be your favorite, it may not be to style if that's what you were aiming for, but fermentation is where the magic happens. I mean, that is where beer is actually created. Now, look, I understand the argument that we need to treat yeast with the utmost care, considering they're tasked with, actually turning the wort into the beer that we all want to drink. But like a few other things, I never really considered the use of yeast nutrients as being all that important. However, a few experiences did influence my perspective on the matter. We're going to be getting into that, as well as the results of a fascinating experiment later in this episode. But first, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique perks from YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live brew day with a Brülosophy contributor, among many other things. You can learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. And if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review of our show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd really appreciate that, as well as it helps people who may not have heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who I'm convinced are doing so much to keep this hobby alive, whether that's through their awesome brewing and beer-related videos for their YouTube channel, offering badass brewing gear, or spreading the love by sponsoring outfits like Brülosophy. We really appreciate all of it and completely stand by our promotion of their products. We love everything that Clawhammer has to offer brewers, like their high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used both their 120-volt and their 240-volt systems, and they are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really does put the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits, as well as ingredients and other gear. Whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Brad Pence wrote in with a comment after listening to our recent episode where we focused on gelatin fining a Kolsch. He said, I am from Burton-on-Trent and grew up a 2-minute walk from the A.B. Vickers where isinglass is made. So I thought I'd add some interesting info about this fining agent. From my understanding, at least, the reason it's still used by traditional cask breweries is its amazing ability to have a cask of beer be shaken around, but still bind all of the negatively charged particles to keep the beer clear. When breweries deliver casks to pubs, they usually drop them into the cellar from height onto a crash mat. Then they roll them around to where they're going to store them to finish conditioning the cask and serve when the beer is ready. Isinglass is still used today for this coincidentally useful property. The history of beer really is interesting. What say you, Jordan? That's an interesting concept, at least for me, in terms of why somebody would use isinglass over, say, gelatin.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I really associate it with British cask beer, and that's something I've heard as well, is that you have to let them settle a little bit before you serve them, because you're kind of, creating a cloud of, stuff when you move these things around. You need to give it a chance to settle down. And we see the same things with our homebrew kegs, right? I know you've done it. You add your gelatin, but then you need to move your keg and all of a sudden it's cloudy again. And so you really need to give these things a chance to settle out, because if you disturb them, you're going to get those fluffy bottoms.
Yeah, fluffy bottoms. God, remember that term? Look, if isinglass is somehow better, or I suppose faster at dropping out a solution than gelatin, allowing for like bumped kegs to more readily clear up, I would be all in. I admittedly presumed that both isinglass and gelatin are collagen based, and so they essentially acted the same way, chemically when you add it to beer as a fining agent. But maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't know. The fact that we've not yet done a single experiment focused on isinglass is kind of nuts to me. So I think we need to get Will to do it because of his love of calling isinglass fish bladder finings. That'd be a good one. But yeah, maybe it is more, maybe it does what it sounds like Brad is saying, that it does fall out of solution quicker than gelatin. I'm just not convinced because I know that they're both, collagen based, positively charged, ions that attract those negatively charged particles and drop it out of solution. I don't know why one would go faster, but if it does, that'd be rad. So thanks for the email, Brad. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Don't forget to grab your Brülosophy merch over at brülosophy.com/shop. We're offering more options than we ever have before, like t-shirts, hoodies, and hats to fanny packs, shorts, coffee mugs, and so much more. Prices are very reasonable and international shipping is now available. Again, you can head to brülosophy.com/shop and click one of the product images on that page, which will redirect you to our Dashery store, or you can go straight to Dashery at brülosophy.dashery.com. We've also put a link in the description of this episode.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today.
I'm not sure what the incidences are now of new brewers screwing up these days, as I feel like things are just so much more advanced compared to when we started brewing, Jordan. But, back then, the biggest presumed culprit of issues, after contamination, of course, was something having to do with yeast and fermentation, particularly in terms of things like pitch rate and fermentation temperatures. In addition to the more manual methods for improving yeast health, though, like yeast starters would be one of them, some brewers leaned on the use of exogenous nutrients to increase the chances of their yeast performing well. Before we get into nutrients specifically, let's talk about yeast. I feel like on this show, we're 439 episodes in, and I don't feel like we've really broken down exactly what fermentation is. So we're going to geek out a little bit on this one.
All right, well, let's get into the importance of yeast. And everyone knows what this does. It's consuming sugars in wort that produce alcohol and CO2 in a process that we call fermentation. But Marshall, what exactly is happening during fermentation?
Yes, and this is the part that we're going to geek out on a little bit. Disclaimer, we are not microbiologists, but by virtue of the fact that we have been brewing for, I think, collectively almost 40 years, we have learned a lot about these cool little microorganisms that do the work that we love so much. So what exactly is happening during fermentation? Well, through a process called glycolysis, yeast takes up sugars, and the sugars that are in wort would be glucose, and then afterwards maltose and maltotriose, and then it breaks them down to pyruvate through a series of enzymatic steps. Now, under anaerobic conditions, just meaning that there's no oxygen there, this pyruvate gets converted to ethanol and CO2 as a way of regenerating what they refer to as NAD+, which acts like a sort of engine that requires ongoing maintenance to keep working. So if you think about this process as being the thing that actively builds the engine that is doing the work, okay, to try to make it an analog here. The sugar in wort then is kind of like the gasoline. It's the fuel. Nitrogen, amino acids, vitamins, and lipids are what manufacture those engine parts to keep it running well, and they are not as prevalent in wort. So keep that in mind, right? Those things that we need to keep that engine running well, the engine that we refer to as yeast, aren't as prevalent in wort as they could be to ensure that they run really well. So that's why we add nutrients. We're going to talk about nutrients here in a minute. Now, when we talk about yeast health, there are a couple main things that we tend to focus on. And the first one I think everybody is familiar with is viability.
Yeah, viability is simply the percentage of living cells in a given sample of yeast. And, so you wouldn't want to pitch a slurry or a package of yeast that has like 0% viability, because that means that all the yeast cells are dead. And so higher viability means you have a higher cell count and, in theory, a stronger fermentation. So that's why pitch rate is really important, and it's often a function of the viability. So you can use some simple online calculators to figure out how much yeast you need to pitch given the package date and thus the viability of the yeast you have.
Right. And those calculators, people need to keep in mind, those are not hard, objective. They're predictors. If you hear that you need to pitch, or you plug into your calculator that it says you need 350 billion cells, right, for the volume of beer that you're going to ferment, there's no way, even if you were to plate it and count it, you're still getting a predictive, you're not counting every single cell is what I'm trying to say. So people who get really caught up on specifics when it comes to viability, I feel like you're wasting your energy. Mm-hmm. What you want is to pitch highly viable. There's concerns about over pitching, which just means that, if you need 350 billion cells and you're pitching 700 billion cells, I'm not entirely convinced that that's a bad thing. I think you'll have a quicker fermentation and maybe a little bit less fermentation character, which might be a good thing based on the style that you're brewing. But viability is important because it means that you have the workforce to do what you need to do in a way that's not going to stress them out. So the number one way, let's go with the two main ways that people are pitching, are getting to the viability that they desire is one, pitching, say, multiple packs of yeast. We use imperial yeast almost exclusively at Brülosophy, and part of the reason for that is that their viability out of the package is 200 billion cells, which is good for like 80% of beer styles. We found that it works even in styles that may require more yeast. It still is very viable yeast. But the main way, I think, is yeast starters, right? You're propagating yeast. You're causing those cells to bud and to create more yeast. Now, we're going to talk about budding here in a minute and why yeast nutrient comes into play with that. But the other main thing that I feel like doesn't get nearly enough focus is vitality. And we have this was a concept that was presented to me by Colin Kaminsky, co-author of the Water book with John Palmer. He had messaged me, 12, 13 years ago saying, everybody focuses on viability, but have you seen this study from Coors about vitality? And it's fascinating. Now, vitality just refers to the metabolic robustness of those living cells. So basically how ready those living cells are to get to work. So it doesn't take into account anything else except for their readiness. It's almost like, somebody who is priming to run a race and they're over and stretching and they're doing all that. And you compare that to somebody who just gets out of bed and runs. The person who's prepared for it is ostensibly going to do better.
Right. And so, this is why you've seen things like vitality starters pop up where people are just spinning a little bit of wort and they're, perhaps fresh or even old pack of yeast during the brew day to just kind of wake them up. And so I can only imagine that the smack pack and the Y yeast packs, that's what it's doing, is vitalizing the yeast before they get to work.
Absolutely. I don't know if Y yeast has ever used that terminology to describe the whole smack pack thing, but that has to be what it does, because there's no way that feeding those yeast right before you're about to pitch is going to lead to propagation. It's not going to increase the cell count. What it's doing is it's preparing those yeast to go to work. Now, that is exactly what the reason I'm focusing on vitality is because that is what yeast nutrients target, is vitality. Yeast nutrients are not going to encourage viability by any stretch of the imagination, right? Viability is you're going to increase viability just by pitching yeast into work no matter what. It's the vitality. It's ensuring that those yeast have what they need to do the work that you want them to do. Now, living cells, little definition of how vitality works. Living cells that are depleted of their internal reserves of glycogen, sterols, and unsaturated fatty acids are low vitality. They are sapped of their energy, which can lead to extended lag, sluggish fermentation, and reduced attenuation, among other things. Basically just fermentation problems. And so you add a little bit of yeast nutrient and you're basically adding this thing in there that these yeasts need that isn't necessarily present in the wort. This is why so many brewers focus on, and a lot of them do. I know people who, as a matter of course, use their preferred yeast nutrient, and there are several we're going to break down here in a minute, to ensure that those yeast have what they need. I just think it's kind of neat.
Yeah, this yeast nutrient can really help diminish vitality problems. And if your yeast isn't in the best shape, we might as well give it a fighting chance and add this stuff. Wort does have some of the stuff in there, and fresher yeast from the laboratory is supposed to have more stuff kind of in reserves. But if your yeast is really old, or if you're pitching into a super nutrient deficient medium like wine or cider, you really need this stuff. And so we're really lucky, actually, that wort at least has some of it, and it gives you a fighting chance without necessarily requiring yeast nutrient.
Yeah, you mentioned cider, and I was probably going to bring this up later. That was the turning point for me. Is I would pitch this yeast into just store-bought apple juice, and it would ferment, it would dry out, it would be great, but it would take forever to get going. And Jake Houlihan, past contributor Jake, was like, dude, add some yeast nutrients, see what happens. It reduced that lag by over a day. I was shocked. It's pretty nuts what adding yeast nutrient can do in terms of that. So that's kind of a nice example of a nutrient absent liquid apple juice and what a nutrient can do when you add that exogenous nutrient to it. So what exactly is yeast nutrient purported to do? Well, it supplies the building blocks that yeast need beyond the sugar that is present in wort. And what is this? That's assimilable nitrogen, or YAN, vitamins, especially B complex, which yeast require to do their work, and then minerals like zinc. I think zinc's probably the main one people focus on, but magnesium and stuff like that. Some products also include sterols and lipids and cell wall material, which yeast benefit from too.
Yeah, it's kind of weird that if you add dead yeast cells, it somehow serves as a yeast nutrient. And I've actually heard that you can use that in a pinch, is just like pour some yeast in your in your boil. Basically, it will kill the yeast and then create a little bit of yeast nutrient going into the fermentation.
Well, that's when we're going to break down the different types of yeast nutrient that are out there, and I think you're going to be surprised to hear that may have been what you did in your experiment. It's very interesting. So we've kind of talked about it already, but here's the thing. I found this old, I think it was like a Homebrew Talk post from like 15, 20 years ago or something, of I think it was a microbiologist who was breaking down what exactly yeast nutrients do. I was researching for this episode, and he goes, here's the deal. He's like 90% of wort is going to be perfectly nutrient rich for 90% of the beers that you're going to make and the yeast that you're going to use to make those beers. It's like, exogenous nutrients aren't really required. So what are those 10% of times where you might need it? You're looking at like high OG beers where immediately, regardless of the viability of that yeast, you are stressing them out by virtue of putting them into this insanely strong, wort. Certain types of beers that you like, lagers, that you really want to just be super clean, it might benefit from some yeast nutrients so that it doesn't have to work during that lag phase. So stuff like that, right? So the consequences, though, of not using yeast nutrient, I just kind of want to focus a little bit on the fact that it's we're not trying to tell you that you got to use yeast nutrient in every single batch of beer that you make. I don't want it to feel that way. It's almost more like insurance. And so let's make that the focus. You're looking at increased lag phase, sluggish or stuck fermentations, poor flocculation, so you might have a hazier beer than you desired, and an extended cleanup phase. That to me is the most problematic one, because it can be difficult sometimes when you're sampling a beer that has reached FG, and you're like, well, it's done, final gravity is reached. Why don't I just package it now? It could still be that yeast is cleaning up byproducts that you don't want in that beer. I have certainly experienced that, where I package just a little bit too early, and I have to warm the beer back up to get it to do its thing, right? To reabsorb or whatever it is, those byproducts I don't want in the beer.
And I'm curious, in your research, did you find any very specific acknowledgments there? For example, I'm curious if, like, for a lager fermentation, that you run the risk of diacetyl not clearing as fast, or I don't know, acetaldehyde, et cetera. Like, were there any specific off flavors that one might expect that could be associated with the lack of nutrient?
Basically what I found was a lot of general speculation, but from people who have like a background and authority on this stuff. You think about what it is exactly that yeast nutrient is doing. It is not removing those byproducts. It is assisting the yeast and making them more likely to reabsorb those byproducts. So it's the nutrient isn't the magic stuff. It's the yeast still. You're just supplying them with those building blocks to be able to do their job better. So I would imagine, again, this is my own speculation, that, like you said, if it's acetaldehyde, if you're making a lager and there's acetaldehyde in it and you're tasting that, or there's diacetyl or whatever it is that is a byproduct of yeast, ostensibly adding yeast nutrient would make that cleanup faster. It's not necessarily going to make it not present from the start, right? I don't know. That's my way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and I would imagine that, yeast nutrient can't resolve a bunch of other sins. So if you're pitching a teaspoon of lager yeast in a 10-gallon batch, or, you're contaminated, et cetera, it's not going to totally clean all that up. But should some other things, need a little bit of a fighting chance, this is certainly a good piece of insurance.
Exactly. All right, so let's break down different types of yeast nutrient. There are a handful out there, and even after doing the research for this episode and writing all of this down, I'm still confused by why you would choose one over the other. But let's start with what is perhaps one of the most commonly talked about yeast nutrients, which is diammonium phosphate, or DAP. This is a pure inorganic source of nitrogen. It is a chemical that you are a chemical yeast nutrient that you are adding to wort to assist with fermentation overall. I don't know exactly what the diammonium phosphate does. Now, emphasis on the word ammonium and the fact that it is inorganic. This is like created in a lab, I guess. Have you ever used DAP before?
I have, but only in like cider and mead. So that one is, I don't hear too much in the beer world these days. And I think it's more focused on nutrient deficient mediums, like simple sugar sources from fruit and honey.
Yeah, that's what I've heard as well, is that you're really adding that because those fruit musts really do lack nitrogen, but nitrogen is absolutely essential for yeast to do their job. So that's what you're adding is, DAP is going to add that nitrogen so yeast can do their thing. As we move along, I think things are going to start to sound a little bit more familiar for the brewers, at least. So there are complex organic nutrients as well. And the most popular one is Fermade O, which is autolyzed yeast. That means dead yeast. And this supplies organic nitrogen in the form of free amino acids rather than ammonia like DAP.
Right. And that reminds me of another one I've heard of, Fermade K, which apparently is a nutrient blend. So you got your DAP, but you've also got amino acids and other micronutrients. And again, the O and the K, those are two ones that I've always thought of being associated with fruit or, honey beverages.
Wine, stuff like that. Yeah. So here's the thing. I have, over the last 20-ish years that I've been brewing, 15 of those I've been making cider. And only, I'd say, the last 5 or 6 years have I been adding nutrients to my apple juice before pitching the yeast. I have used 3 different types of yeast nutrient, and I've never paid attention to which one it is or what type of nutrient it is. I've used the Y yeast nutrient, I've used the White Labs nutrient, and most recently I've been using the Imperial yeast nutrient. What I'm realizing is that all 3 of those may be different, and I think that's kind of interesting. So another type of nutrient comes from yeast hulls. So these are dead yeast cell walls that contribute no real nitrogen, but they supply lipids and can absorb toxic fermentation byproducts. So this is one where you're like, okay, is it that I want the yeast to have this nitrogen so that they work really hard, or am I going to try to hyper focus on the yeast's ability to absorb these, gross byproducts of fermentation? That would be an argument for using yeast hulls, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, and that's what I thought these like Cervomyces products were, like Y yeast was the one that classically I used to buy. Imperial, they make some for pro brewers, and they hooked me up with a package, which on the experiment we're going to talk about today, if you look at the article, you can see the big ass jar they sent me. But apparently these also have, in addition to those dried dead yeast cells they give you those trace minerals like zinc, there could be other compounds that are available in these products. So it's kind of like a complete package. But from what I've understood, zinc is really an important one that we're missing in our worts that we're creating. You're getting, I think, maybe a little bit from the malt, But like things like magnesium, you're going to have some of that present in your existing water source. And, you can add magnesium to your mash even, but you don't want to overdo it is what I've heard. But you're going to get some of that as well, probably sufficient amount of it from your water source and your malt. But zinc is notably lacking. And so I think that's a really important thing that these products are adding, at least in the beer realm. And so, a final one is you can add pure zinc, and we've actually done experiments on that. One of our buddies in the homebrew club here, he actually made all the members these little vials of liquefied zinc that he made. So I've been dosing that lately, and it's really easy. And so that's another option is zinc, just going straight to the source.
Yeah, I believe Cade did that experiment, and we won't give the results away. Perhaps we'll talk about it. If we haven't already, we'll talk about it in a future episode. But these trace minerals matter. And like you said, if you're using, your tap water, you're probably going to have the minerals that you need for fermentation. Again, adding nutrients, it's a cheap way to ensure that the yeast have what they need. I want to keep impressing that upon our listeners. We're not sitting here saying you have to go get the yeast nutrients and use them. For the most part, you've already got them in there. But it provides that sense of insurance. So what are some alternatives that brewers rely on in place of nutrients that do a really good job of providing what yeast need? I think the number one thing is oxygenation, ensuring that the wort has oxygen in it, because yeast require oxygen to synthesize sterols and unsaturated fatty acids. The synthesis of those things are necessary to build those healthy cell membranes during the growth phase of fermentation. Another little trick, and I know that this one is kind of contentious, is transferring over a little bit of kettle trube. That provides those lipids and sterols, right? That trube has those lipids and sterols that yeast can use directly, and it reduces the need for oxygenation. A lot of people are getting, I sold my oxygenation equipment a long time ago because I found that it doesn't do anything for me. And I always allow just a little bit of trube from the kettle to make its way to the fermentation vessel. I know that you're not a fan of that, right?
The dirty little secret is everyone is getting kettle trube into their fermenters if they're not doing a secondary settling step. Like, I guess if you let your wort sit overnight in your kettle, for 4 hours or something like that, or I guess if you're using a racking cane as well, you could rack clear wort over, but you're getting some of that cold break into your fermenter. So, you're going to have a little bit of insurance associated with that. Perhaps don't pour the entire volume of liquid, through a funnel, because then you're going to get a ton of trube, and that can have adverse effects. But you are going to get some of those lipids and sterols directly from that kettle trube, and most homebrew processes are going to get some naturally. So if you are doing a settling step and kind of like the Lodo school of thought, that's when the exogenous yeast nutrients are really important, because you've eliminated most of those in your really clear transfer process.
Right. And one way to look at it is that that wort is now closer in constitution to a fruit must, in that you've removed a lot of that stuff that we, us less anal brewers would, who are transferring some kettle trube over and stuff, that would normally be present. So we already talked about yeast starters, but that's another way to increase both viability and vitality. So we have those options as well. Now, how do we use yeast nutrient? This is sort of going to depend on the type of nutrients, but it's usually just a surprisingly small dose for a 5-gallon batch. And it's usually added, late in the boil or just prior to pitching your yeast. It is possible to overdose nutrients. So you want to follow the instructions that are on whatever nutrient that you get, particularly if you're using DAP. That diammonium phosphate, you're going to increase the ammonia levels, which becomes toxic for yeast. So you have to be careful with how much you're adding. Again, just follow the instructions on the package. Now let's focus. The experiment that we're going to talk about in the next segment was specifically the impact of yeast nutrient when you're reusing or repitching yeast that was used to ferment a prior batch. Let's focus on that for a minute.
Right. So the thing that we've often heard is with your pitching, dry yeast, for example, you don't have to add oxygen because they already have the sterols built up in that, yeast dehydration process. So you're good to go. You've also heard that you don't need yeast nutrient because they're kind of packaged with the full cell wall package. And we hear the same thing with fresh liquid yeast as well. It's really once you start to get into multiple generations that you've started to deplete those, important pieces of the cell wall and the, yeast vitality, yeast health, et cetera, over the process of several fermentations. And what they say is it becomes really important to add yeast nutrient when you're reusing yeast for multiple generations, because you don't have the same high level of pure yeast product that you start with from a fresh pitch.
Exactly. And the other thing is, and this is, I mentioned the whole yeast budding and propagation. Every time a yeast buds, it's splitting its internal reserves. It's splitting the resources that it has available. So you are every reuse, you are ostensibly getting, half or less than half of what was originally there per yeast cell. If you had propagated that yeast. That was news to me when I read that. I thought that was interesting. So repeat generations, including washing yeast and all of that, reduce those glycogen and sterol reserves because they get split with every budding event. So by adding nutrient, again, you're making up for that while increasing viability. You're adding back those nutrients that those yeast need. Again, you're going to replenish the sterols, the enzymes, and the glycogen that has been drained from prior fermentations. So to me, if you're reusing yeast, which that's what Brülosophy was kind of built on, was the whole, propagating yeast in starters and not having to go and buy yeast for every batch, probably not a bad idea to just throw some yeast nutrient in there as well to give them what they need. So let's focus a little bit on the style as well that you did the experiment on, which was Saison. The BJCP describes Saison as a family of refreshing, highly attenuated, hoppy, and fairly bitter Belgian ales with a very dry finish and high carbonation, characterized by a fruity, spicy, sometimes phenolic fermentation profile and the use of cereal grains and sometimes spices for complexity. Several variations in strength and color exist. I don't know about you, Jordan, but I remember, I don't hear it talked about much these days, but a while ago, when it came to Saison, there was always talk about, the yeast that we use and lag and slow starts and just not attenuating very well. This seems like an ideal style to test yeast nutrients on.
Certainly, everyone's heard of the DuPont stall around 1030 SG, all of a sudden it just stops. And you've heard of a lot of different, suggested approaches like the open fermentation, pitching a secondary strain, yada, yada, yada. And so maybe yeast nutrient could help us get over that hump. So we thought, why not? Let's put it to the test and make a Saison.
Exactly. And by doing that, what we would expect to see, or maybe hope to see, is reduced lag, stronger fermentation with good attenuation, and then a reuptake of any of those undesirable fermentation byproducts, which in Saison, you kind of want those fermentation byproducts. That's the whole point of using yeasts like B56 rustic, which is from imperial yeast, which I think we have to at least spend a minute talking about the fact that it is a diastatic strain, or an STA1 positive strain, meaning that the glucoamylase activity chews through dextrins left alone by other yeast strains, which requires more time for the culture to keep synthesizing enzymes and maintaining the cell membrane strength. So again, it sounds like nutrients can provide those enzymes, thus encouraging faster synthesis and fermentation.
Right. And so with these Saisons, one way to get that to finally finish up, it could get close to 1.000 even, is getting that fermentation warm, especially at the tail end. And so it helps, this can be a more metabolically demanding on the cell wall than cooler, slower fermentation. So maybe that nutrient can actually reduce stress on the yeast in these warm fermentations that we're using to encourage the production of the flavors that we like, as well as finish the fermentation.
Exactly. And I think that's a good point. Saisons are kind of known for being fermented warmer. It's one of the few styles that people don't get angry at when we talk about fermenting them warm. But that warmer environment, while it absolutely, yeast are going to favor those warmer environments, by which I mean they're going to work faster in those warmer fermentations, it still contributes a level of stress, we keep using that term, to the yeast. So adding nutrients will help to reduce that stress. So maybe it is, going to be beneficial in this style of beer. Now, out of the, 15 or so Saisons that I've made in my day, I've reused yeast in all but 2 or 3 of them. and I only added yeast nutrient none of those times. So I've never actually done this before. While none of those ended up being dumpers, a few definitely showed increased lag and some of the other, I guess, symptoms of that you would expect in a Saison yeast using or Saison using reused yeast. Would that have happened if I had tossed in some yeast nutrient? That is the question that you aim to answer in a recent experiment, Jordan. Those results when we're back from this break. Stop guessing and start perfecting your craft with Brewfather, the ultimate tool for recipe design. Brewfather Premium unlocks advanced inventory tracking, tilt integration for real-time fermentation monitoring, and seamless cloud sync across all of your devices. But wait, there's more. Premium Plus just changed the game with Brewfather's brand new AI recipe integration. Whether you're looking to clone a rare commercial classic or need a creative spark for a unique grain bill, Brewfather AI helps you build balanced, world-class recipes in seconds. Brewing is a science. Make it art with Brewfather Premium Plus by visiting brewfather.app today. That's brewfather.app. Better beer is just a click away. Just the idea of reusing yeast makes some brewers feel anxious. Then there are those of us who have done it hundreds of times, many commercial outfits included. What impact does this have on ultimate yeast performance, particularly when repitching yeast used to ferment a prior batch? Would adding yeast nutrient be beneficial?
Exactly, and that's why I wanted to find out, and I think a Saison is a really fun way to test it out, given that we do see some lags and stalls with this yeast. So I will typically take all of my yeast strains a few generations out, maybe around 5 for clean yeast strains like lager and ale, clean ale like Chico or something like that. I'll ditch them and get a new pitch or something like that. But with Saison, it's kind of funky, it's kind of estery, it's kind of phenolic, like I'll just let it go. And in fact, as you know, I let one go a little too far and it ultimately made a sour beer. So there is a limit to this stuff, but I am known to have multi-generation Saison yeast on hand. And so I figured let's brew up some Saisons and see if this yeast nutrient actually makes an impact.
Yeah, I'm looking at your recipe right now. 87% Pilsner malt, 9% wheat malt, 4% dextrose or corn sugar. That's minus the corn sugar. That's right around what I do for all of my Saisons. A little bit of Pilsner malt or a bunch of Pilsner malt, a little bit of wheat malt. Boom, good to go. The fact you added corn sugar arguably adds another. You're injecting even a little bit more stress for those yeasts. So good call on that.
Yeah, and Saison, you can do whatever you want, man. You can have 100% Pilsner malt. You can have 100% pale malt, like, 2-row. You can use 40% wheat. You can use rye. There's so much room to play around here. And in fact, we probably should do some more experiments on grist in Saison. Can you actually taste the rye when there's such a phenolic yeast strain? I don't know that you can.
No.
But this corn sugar bit, I picked that up from this Saison brewery. I don't even know if they're around anymore. And I read about it in a magazine, but they had this beer, I think, called Saison is Dead. And they were using some corn sugar to increase attenuation. I heard another podcast recently with some Saison makers, and they're saying they're trying to push this thing as close to zero Plato as they possibly can. And so it could even use some enzyme to help get there. And so that was kind of the theory, is like, let's get as close to zero Plato as you can, and sugar certainly helps.
Well, yeah, and one of the things, not to hyper-focus here just on the grist of Saison in general, but one of the things that I read a long time ago about the reason you might use a non-barley malt in the grain bill is because it gives more for that yeast to do, because you want Saison to have that fermentation character. And so by using wheat malt or rye malt or whatever it is, it's not necessarily that you're going for the flavor. Rye malt will absolutely contribute beta-glucans that are going to give you a thicker, creamier, or more luscious mouthfeel. We've shown that in experiments. Which, when you pair that with the absolute, like, real objective dryness of a Saison, it can be really nice. It can be very, very nice. In fact, there are certain Saison strains, I believe it's the French Saison strain, that also, what is it? I forget exactly what the explanation is for why it contributes that thickness as well. But that is something that a lot of people are looking for in their Saison, is to have that impression of body while the beer is still very dry. So that's why I use rye or wheat or whatever in my Saison.
And let's talk about the brewing process. But before we do, I will mention I'm solidly team Belgian Saison. Just not a fan of that French Saison character.
Amen. Yep.
That's just me. So with these, you want to drive attenuation, and the Belgians are doing a step mash. So I've got the electronic brewing system. Why not? It's super easy. So I did 144F or 62C for an hour, then raised that up to an alpha rest at 160F or 71C for just 20 minutes, and then out for your mash out at 170F or 77C for 10 minutes to increase lautering flow. And then now that the mash is complete, remove those green baskets and boil for 60 minutes. We got 7 grams of Warrior at 60. We got a couple ounces of Tettnang, 57 grams at 30 minutes. And then another couple ounces or 57 grams of Tettnang at 5 minutes. And I just really like to get a little bit of that. And I know you love Tettnang, but get a little bit that spicy hop character to complement the spicy phenolics of a Saison yeast.
And that, that's what's going to be, this is more of a, arguably kind of a traditional approach to Saison recipe here. But if you've ever had a Saison that is hopped heavily with Mosaic, oh my God. If you haven't had it, you're missing. It is so insanely good. It's like, to me, that's like a match made in heaven. The Mosaic, that complexity of the Mosaic hop, that blueberry diesel-y kind of kerosene thing with the phenolics of a Belgian Saison. Oh, it's heavenly.
Yeah. Nelson's also really good, but I agree. Mosaic's a perfect one. But you'll notice what's not being added at the end of this boil is grains of paradise or any sort of like peppercorns or anything like that. You do not need that in a Saison, just like let the yeast do its thing. You don't need other weird adjuncts to mimic that.
Right.
All right, so we chill those down a little bit. I like to pitch this stuff around 65C. That's a trick that I've heard, and I stand by it. I know that there are some people that pitch their Saisons at 80, and I know there's some commercial breweries that do that with great success. But something about the homebrew scale, it just works to pitch a little cooler and let it rise up to 75 or 80 or so. So that's my approach. But so I get that chilled to like 65F, and we're looking at 1050 OG, which is pretty much right on the money. But like you said at the style description, there's session Saison or table Saison. There's imperial Saison. So this is just kind of right in the middle.
Oh, 1050, like 1048 to 1052 for Saison is money in my opinion, because it's going to dry out. If you're using the right yeast and your process is right, you're going to dry that beer out to probably 1004 FG, maybe even closer to 1.000. So you're going to have the alcohol you want there. You don't need to go heavy or high OG to get that, in my opinion.
So now it's actually time to add the variable. And, we noted that we've already finished the boil, we've already chilled, but we didn't mention yeast nutrient. And that's because when I'm adding a powdered yeast nutrient product, I add that to the fermenter. What I've heard is that if you do a really good job of getting that hop break to settle at the bottom of your kettle, there's a risk that the yeast nutrient that you added to the boil could actually just be caught in that trub. It doesn't make it into the fermenter. And so, if you're using Werflock or Irish Moss or Brutan B, you're going to get really great flocculation of the hop break. And, some's going to go into your fermenter, like we said earlier in the prior segment, but a lot's going to get left behind in your kettle, assuming you're not dumping all of it through a funnel. And so that's why this is a way to ensure that it makes it into your fermenter. Just, brew up your little yeast nutrient solution and add it straight into your fermenter, and you have no risk that it doesn't make it in.
I have never considered that. Again, I'm not a yeast nutrient user in beer. I don't know if I've ever used it in a batch of beer. That's my admission here. I would always think you just add it to the boil, maybe with your final hop addition or something. So good, that's a good point. Good tip, listeners. It is going to fall out of solution. If what you're trying to do is improve your fermentation quality, then maybe you add it to the fermentation.
Right. And so for this experiment, Imperial Yeast provided me with a industrial size container. I still have some too. I think I'm going to use some tomorrow in my annual Fest Beer Brew Day. And this is a custom formulated blend that's designed to optimize fermentation health, especially when working with high gravity worts, like we said earlier, adjunct heavy grist, or late generation, aka reused yeast, just like in this experiment. And it adds zinc, calcium, phosphate, and magnesium.
So it's weird because we talked earlier about Cervomyces blends, which or I don't even know if it's a blend, which I believe in the imperial yeast nutrient kind of falls under that. It has those dead yeast cell walls as well, but it also has all of these trace minerals that yeast need to do their work well. To me, it's kind of an ideal yeast nutrient for beer. I've used it. The only reason I have my industrial size imperial yeast nutrient, they sent it to me as well, is because of cider. I only use it in cider, and I am telling you, it kicks up fermentation so much faster than when you pitch yeast into a non-nutrient, must. Pretty crazy stuff.
Right, and you're not reusing yeast these days. You're just pitching fresh every time. And, there are rumors that yeast manufacturers might even be including some yeast nutrient in the package, especially Y yeast. That's pretty obvious. So, you're probably fine. But if you're going to be reusing yeast like I was, I think it's some added insurance. So how I did this is I prepared that nutrient by combining 2.5 grams of the nutrient from Imperial with a small amount of water. And I just boil it in the microwave that I have in my little basement home brewery. I did it for 5 minutes. I'm not that concerned with contamination with this kind of stuff, but just to be safe, boil it for 5 minutes in the microwave and then just add it directly into the fermenter to one of the batches of wort. So at this point, I'm adding yeast, and I did about 60 milliliters of 4th generation Imperial Yeast B56 Rustic, which is a Belgian Saison yeast, STA positive, phenolic. Some people rumor that maybe it's used at DuPont as part of a blend of yeast, but it's sourced from De Blaugy, which I think the rumor is that they get their yeast from DuPont anyway. So
that's what I heard.
It's a really awesome yeast strain for Saison, and it's too bad that Imperial doesn't make it anymore. And so if they ever release this as a seasonal, definitely get your hands on Rustic. It's an awesome Saison yeast.
And what you'll hear, actually, I'll be curious if you have heard this, but a lot of Saison brewers, there are brewers who brewed various styles, and then there are brewers who seem to just have a focus. I think sour beer is a perfect example. Lagers are a perfect example. And there's Saison brewers. They are like hardcore, do all of the things to create the best Saison they can. And one of the little tricks that I've heard from these folks is that they actually feel that reusing yeast is beneficial to Saison because of what we talked about earlier, all of the stresses, quote, that reusing yeast puts on that yeast in subsequent fermentations is actually a good thing. So have you heard that before?
I haven't, but I guess I could see that because another thing that's really, in my opinion, important with Saison is pitch rate, and I underpitch on Saison.
Exactly.
So if I'm shooting for like 0.75 or 1.0 for an ale fermentation, and then lager like 1.5, 2.0 pitch rate for cold fermented lagers. For Saison, I'm more like 0.3, 0.5. And by adding less yeast, you're stressing the fermentation. And, one man's off flavor is a Saison's characteristic defining flavor. And so perhaps with subsequent generations, you're getting more of that stress and more of the phenolic and ester expression that we want. And so I think that really brings it back home to the yeast nutrient. Yes, we want those flavors, but we want to make sure that the fermentation finishes, right? And so it would be interesting if the yeast nutrient actually had a detrimental effect and created too much of a stress-free environment and diminished some of those flavors. So why don't we see how fermentation goes, and then we can kind of investigate whether people could taste a difference.
This to me, and these are objectively observable findings here. This is where the real interesting stuff comes out.
So after 5 days of fermentation at 67F or 19C, I took a hydrometer measurement. And, one thing that some people say is the first 90% of Saison is fermented in the first 5 days, and then the last 10% takes another month. Because you do see this really long tail just like slowly chewing at those, more complex sugars. And so
that would be the diastaticus, though, I believe, right? I mean, that's kind of the argument is that STA1 plus or positive yeast, that diastaticus just takes longer to ferment than your standard, to do its job, right? Than regular yeast strains.
That seems to be the case. And so, we took a hydrometer reading here to see how it was doing after just 5 days. I would not expect to be finished. And wow, what a difference we saw. The batch that had no nutrient was at 1016, whereas the batch that had nutrient was already down to 1011. So that's a pretty stark difference for just like a tablespoon of this little powder.
Crazy. I mean, again, could you even taste a 5-point difference at this? I doubt it, but this is objective. That yeast nutrient, you did nothing else different except for add yeast nutrient. And we've already got this data point that was easily observable that fermentation, that would suggest that fermentation is kicking off more healthy than in the non-nutrient batch. Fascinating.
Right. And, rustic de Blaugy is not known to have the same DuPont stall. And so it would have been really interesting if I had used DuPont here to see if maybe one had stalled and one hadn't, thanks to yeast nutrient. But at the very least, we did see objectively a quicker attenuation time or more vigorous fermentation as a function of that yeast nutrient. But we still have to finish the fermentation and let the extra stuff that remains get eaten up a little bit slower at this point. So I raised that temperature to 75F or 24C over the course of the following week. And then I did a final hydrometer measurement. And what do you know? They're both at the same FG, 1.004.
Which is beautiful for a Saison. The fact that they both ended up achieving that 1.004, to me, is kind of validating as a non-nutrient user, because you're like, okay, fermentation kicked off, went a little bit faster in that the batch that you added nutrients to, but ultimately the same thing ended up happening if they taste the same, right? They ended up attenuating exactly the same amount. So again, it'd be great to get fermentation going a little bit faster. You could maybe justify using nutrient there, but if after the same amount of time they ended up at the same FG, then maybe not,
Right. And I didn't have tilts, measuring gravity constantly in both. I wasn't taking hydrometer measurements every 12 hours. So I would assume that the one that had nutrient finished first. And by the time I took my final hydrometer measurements, the other one had caught up. So I think that this is a good argument for a professional brewery where time is money and they could reduce their tank time with the yeast nutrient in a Saison beer.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, me, I'm crazy and I've got to bottle condition all of my Saisons. There's just something about that lively carbonation, that rocky head, and just the beautiful, rustic serving method of a thick Belgian bottle, a bottle conditioned Saison. So that's what I did. I'm using priming sugar, probably 3.2 volumes or something like that. And then I leave them in a box in my basement for 4 weeks so they can do that re-fermentation in the bottle before I chill them down and serve them to tasters.
Yes, you did. And the bottle conditioning, if you think about it, probably added another level of stress for those yeast because they have to kind of work again. They went to sleep. They're done fermenting, but now they have to get back up and do a little bit more work to make that carbonation higher carbonation than you would expect in any other style, really. So I like that choice.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I didn't add any additional bottling yeast, so it's just what was present was what went into the bottle. So when we take a look at these from an objective perspective, they both look very similar. Pale straw color, clear, really good rocky cap of stark white foam. So just by looking at them, they don't seem to be too different.
Awesome. Okay, so before we get into the blind taster results, I want to talk about your performance. Now, a lot of people put more weight on our totally cited, non-blind biased impressions or our triangle test, performance. I don't. I much prefer blind data. I don't need anything to confirm my own biases. I can do that on my own anyways. So out of the 5 semi-blind triangle test attempts that you did, how many times were you able to identify the unique sample?
This was one of those ones where I just could not tell them apart. I got 2 out of 5 right. Those were, guesses that I got right, which is what we would expect with random guessing anyway. They had the same flavor, aroma, mouthfeel, carbonation. They were indistinguishable to me. So clearly, it seems from my perspective as knowing what the variable is, it might increase fermentation time, at least with this particular strain when using multi-generation yeast. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it made a similar beer without the use of yeast nutrient.
I mean, I'm looking at the photo of these beers next to each. They look identical as well. I mean, there's nothing different about these beers, and I didn't get to taste them, unfortunately, but you did, and I trust your impressions on this, that they just were indistinguishable. Now, of course, like I said earlier, I value the blind taster data way more than I do this single biased data. So you served these beers, the triangle test, to 22 participants, out of which 12 would have needed to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with some level of confidence that, yeah, it really does seem like yeast nutrient had an impact. Out of those 22, again, 12 needed, how many actually chose the odd beer out?
Only 4, which is 18%. That's not significant, and it suggests that tasters could not reliably tell apart Saisons brewed with one with yeast nutrient, one without. And gosh, 4 of 22, that's like really low. Like, we don't typically see that few of successful selections.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's the thing is that randomness is random. Like, it's not always going to be 33%, even if you have identical beers in the cups. You're going to see some variation in that. And in this case, we just happen to see the variation that we very rarely see, which is that a bunch of people just didn't pick the odd beer out randomly. They went with the other ones, and that's the way, again, randomness works. But fascinating finding. So what we can say about this, and I want to hear your thoughts, the yeast nutrient clearly had an impact in terms of fermentation performance, but that fermentation performance didn't seem to carry over into perceptible qualities of the beers, right?
Right. And so I think that this is a very stylistically framed conversation. And we had kind of pondered that maybe it could actually be detrimental and that it would reduce some of that, quote, stress that we want to yield the flavors that we associate with Saison. And clearly it didn't. And so it seems that this is one of those cases where there's really no wrong answer, at least with the de Blaugy strain. If you use it, you're going to get a faster fermentation. If you don't, it's going to taste very similar, and you just need to wait a little bit longer. But I do wonder what would have been the case if this was like a 7th generation, global pitch, and maybe global's too vigorous, like a 7th generation Bavarian lager pitch or something like that, cold fermented. Maybe at that point we would start to see more of an effect. But at least with these like super phenolic strains, it didn't seem to matter.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me. And I think there's an argument for those who really want to have the insurance that fermentation is going to kick off and faster, and you're going to get the attenuation that you're looking for. There's an argument for using yeast nutrient, at least the imperial yeast nutrient that you used in this experiment, because it really did seem to have a palpable impact on that side of things. Just because that didn't carry over perceptibly doesn't mean that there's not value in that. I will absolutely continue using yeast nutrient every time I make cider. I've heard arguments that it's also super good to add when you're making hard seltzers, basically fermenting sugar water for the same exact reasons as must. It is lacking in all of those nutrients, those minerals, the sterols, all of that stuff. Throw in some yeast nutrient, give your yeast what they want, and they're going to perform better for you. That's where the argument for me comes from. It's not necessarily that, it's going to change the flavor of your beer. And it maybe in other styles with other types of nutrient it would. In this case, it just doesn't. When reusing yeast especially, it really didn't seem to have that impact. But I think it's valuable enough, or at least a reasonable enough argument to use it if you're looking for insurance in terms of fermentation quality.
Yep. Or if you want to ensure that your fermentation is fast enough. So if you're trying to bust out a beer for a party, maybe this is one way to get it done a little quicker.
Exactly. Well, that is all the time that we've got for this episode. Don't forget to follow us over at facebook.com/Brülosophy, instagram.com/Brülosophy, and youtube.com/@thebrülosophy show. And you can read more about the experiment that we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brülosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.